What happens when a silence carried for years finally breaks? Not on stage, not in front of flashing cameras, but in the quiet aftermath of an interview, when the world believes the moment has already passed. What if the most powerful confession is not delivered to an audience, but to a single person who has always understood what was never said out loud? Last night, after the interview lights dimmed and the studio emptied, Wang Yibo spoke words to Xiao Zhan that left those who later learned of it utterly shaken. The interview itself had ended smoothly, professionally, almost routinely. Two familiar figures, seated under bright lights, answered questions with practiced grace. Their expressions were calm, controlled, shaped by years of media training and public expectation. To viewers, it appeared like any other appearance, respectful, distant, polished. Yet beneath that surface, there was a history the cameras could not capture, a shared past layered with unspoken understanding, quiet distance, and time that had changed them both. This story isn't over. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. We follow the moments and emotions of your favorite K-drama stars. Stay with us. When the recording ended, staff moved about, equipment was adjusted, and the room began to empty. It was in that in-between space, where performance ends and reality resumes, that the atmosphere shifted. Wang Yibo lingered, not out of obligation, but out of intention. Xiao Zhan noticed, as he always did. Some connections do not require explanation. They are felt instinctively. What followed was not loud. It was not dramatic in the way headlines crave. Wang Yibo did not raise his voice, did not gesture grandly, did not attempt to rewrite the past. Instead, he spoke with a calm that carried weight, the kind that only comes from words rehearsed silently for years. He spoke of gratitude first, of respect, of how some people enter your life not to stay forever in the same way, but to change you permanently. He spoke of moments the public never saw, of pressure shared in silence, of understanding exchanged in glances rather than conversations, of how, in the most difficult seasons, simply knowing Xiao Zhan existed in the same world had been grounding. His confession was not bound by labels. It was not defined by expectation. It was an acknowledgement of emotional truth, of impact, of a bond that had shaped who he became. Xiao Zhan listened without interruption. His expression did not shift dramatically, yet there was a softness in his eyes that betrayed the depth of what he was hearing. Some words do not shock because they are unexpected. They shock because they confirm what was always known but never voiced. When Wang Yibo finished speaking, there was a pause, heavy and reverent, the kind of silence that honors honesty rather than avoiding it. What Xiao Zhan offered in return was simple, but profound. He spoke of growth, of distance that was never resentment, of appreciation that never faded, even when circumstances demanded restraint. He did not deny the weight of Wang Yibo's words, nor did he embellish them. He met them with equal sincerity, acknowledging the shared journey without attempting to define it for anyone else. Those who later became aware of the exchange described it not as a confession meant to change the present, but one meant to heal the past. There was no expectation attached, no demand for response, no narrative imposed. It was closure without separation, connection without possession. In a world that often confuses confession with declaration, this moment stood apart. When the two eventually left the space, they did so separately, returning to their own lives, their own paths. But something intangible had shifted. Not visibly, not publicly, but internally. The kind of shift that comes from finally speaking truth, without fear of how it will be received. For fans, the idea of that quiet exchange was almost overwhelming. Not because it promised anything new, but because it honored what already existed. It reminded people that some of the most meaningful relationships are not meant to be explained or displayed. They are meant to be acknowledged, respected, and carried forward quietly. Wang Yibo's confession was not about love as spectacle. It was about honesty as release. It was about recognizing another person's place in your story without needing to rewrite the ending. And Xiao Zhan's response was not about acceptance or refusal, but about mutual understanding, the rarest form of connection. Long after the interview faded from public conversation, this moment continued to resonate. not because it belonged to the world, but because it never did. It belonged to two people choosing truth over silence, dignity over drama, and sincerity over expectation. Sometimes, the most unforgettable confessions are not the ones shouted into microphones, but the ones spoken quietly, when no one is supposed to be listening. And last night, in that quiet space beyond the cameras, something deeply human was finally allowed to breathe. And still, the weight of that confession did not dissipate with distance or time. It lingered, settling quietly into the spaces between memory and meaning, reshaping how the past was understood without demanding anything of the future. What Wang Yibo had offered was not a request, not a declaration meant to bind, but an acknowledgement powerful enough to stand on its own. In speaking, he had unburdened something that had lived too long in silence. In the days that followed, those close to both men sensed a subtle change. Nothing outward, nothing dramatic. Schedules remained full. Commitments were honored. Smiles appeared where they were expected. Yet beneath the surface, there was a newfound ease, as if a long-held tension had finally loosened its grip. Sometimes, closure does not arrive as an ending, but as clarity. Wang Yibo moved forward with a quiet steadiness. Those who observed him carefully noticed a calm resolve in his demeanor, a softness behind his focus. It was not the calm of detachment, but of honesty finally expressed. He had spoken without asking for permission, without fear of interpretation, and in doing so, reclaimed a part of himself that had been suspended between restraint and regret. Xiao Zhan, too, carried the moment with grace. There was no attempt to revisit it publicly, no effort to frame it for understanding. Some truths are not meant to be revisited. They are meant to be respected. He continued on his path, grounded, reflective, with the quiet assurance of someone who understands that not every meaningful connection requires permanence to be real. For those who learned of the confession, it reframed years of speculation and silence. Not by confirming theories, but by transcending them. It shifted the narrative away from curiosity and toward humanity, away from labels and toward lived experience. It reminded people that relationships are not always defined by proximity or outcome, but by impact. The power of the moment lay in what it refused to become. It did not turn into spectacle. It did not invite explanation. It did not ask to be consumed. Instead, it stood quietly as proof that honesty can exist without exposure, that intimacy can survive without display, and that respect can be the truest form of affection. As time moved forward, the world continued its endless cycle of headlines and distractions. New stories emerged. Attention shifted. But for those who understood the depth of that exchange, something remained unmistakable. A rare example of emotional courage. A reminder that some of the most important conversations happen after the cameras turn away, when there is nothing to gain and everything to release. Wang Yibo's confession was not about changing destiny. It was about honoring it, about recognizing that certain people leave marks on us not because they stay, but because they mattered. And Xiao Zhan's response was not about defining the bond, but about respecting it for what it was and what it would always be. In the end, this was not a story of revelation meant for applause. It was a story of truth spoken softly, received with dignity, and carried forward without demand. A moment between two people who chose understanding over noise, sincerity over spectacle. And perhaps that is why it resonates so deeply. Because in a world that is always watching, always asking, always consuming, they chose a moment that belonged only to them. A confession not meant to echo loudly, but to settle quietly, where the most meaningful truths always reside.